She didn't flinch. Jasmine Crockett looked America in the eye and told the truth. Sitting under the bright, relentless glare of studio lights with millions watching, she delivered something that felt rare in today's political landscape: fearless honesty. Her tone wasn't angry or performative. It was steady, clear, and cutting. With the composure of someone who had walked this path before, who had seen and felt the weight of injustice firsthand, she spoke not from a place of political calculation, but from a deep well of personal experience and collective memory. There was a tension in the air. You could feel it even through the screen. Every word she spoke was a challenge to the status quo, to the comfortable lies that many have grown used to hearing. She called out the double standards, the coded language, the subtle but intentional ways that policies are crafted to harm certain communities while pretending to serve the public good. Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. And in that moment, she became something more than just a representative. She became a vessel for every unheard voice, every dismissed concern, every moment of quiet frustration that Black Americans have endured for generations. She didn't need to raise her voice to make people listen. Her power came from truth, from a place of clarity and moral certainty. She laid out the facts like evidence in a courtroom, knowing the weight they carried. She spoke of housing practices that have stripped wealth from Black families for decades, of healthcare disparities that leave Black mothers more likely to die in childbirth, of education systems starved of funding in neighborhoods that need it most. She didn't point fingers. She painted a picture, vivid, undeniable, and deeply unsettling. She spoke, too, of language, the kind that pretends to be innocent but is loaded with intent, the kind that fuels division while pretending to unify, the kind that assigns labels and creates villains out of communities simply fighting for dignity. She pulled back the curtain on those carefully chosen words, those rehearsed sound bites that sanitize prejudice. She made it impossible to ignore the impact they have, not just on public perception, but on policy, on safety, on opportunity. There was a moment, brief but unforgettable, where she paused. Just for a second. It wasn't hesitation. It was restraint. The kind of pause that comes when you're carrying too much truth and you're deciding how much the world can handle at once. When she spoke again, it wasn't louder, it was deeper. Like she'd decided that if she only got this one moment, this one shot to cut through the noise, she was going to make it count. And she did. She made people uncomfortable, but the right people. The people who've gone their whole lives without having to question their comfort. The ones who've benefited from systems they pretend don't exist. Her words didn't come dressed in apology. They came with conviction. She didn't ask permission to speak. She didn't look for approval. She knew the cost of saying what needed to be said, and she paid it without blinking. What made her delivery so powerful wasn't just the facts, though those were plenty. It was the emotional intelligence behind them. The way she wove history into the present, showing how wounds never fully healed if they were never acknowledged in the first place. She wasn't just talking about policies. She was talking about people, families torn apart, dreams deferred, lives lost, and futures being stolen, one quiet decision at a time. She represented something rare in that moment: accountability. Not the kind that shows up in campaign slogans or photo ops, but the kind that comes from standing in the fire and refusing to move. She wasn't just responding to questions. She was questioning the entire framework, the assumptions, the biases, the carefully constructed narratives that keep inequality alive while pretending to be neutral. And as she spoke, something shifted. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a scream. It was a quiet, collective realization. This is what truth sounds like, when it's unafraid, when it's carried by someone who knows the stakes, when it's delivered not for applause but because silence is no longer an option. This wasn't politics. This was a reckoning. You could sense it the moment she leaned into the microphone, her voice calm but loaded with fire. This wasn't about partisan lines or party talking points. It was about exposing a truth that had gone unchallenged for far too long. In a space where empty rhetoric is the norm, she brought something that couldn't be brushed off or reduced to a soundbite. She brought the weight of history, the sting of lived experience, and the fierce demand for acknowledgement. When she spoke, the conversation shifted. This wasn't the usual debate. It wasn't another round of back and forth for show. This was a gut punch to the sanitized narratives that had protected power and erased harm. She wasn't afraid to confront the uncomfortable, to name the ways in which injustice isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes it's subtle, quiet, even polite. But it's there, embedded in institutions, policies, and attitudes. She pulled the curtain back on all of it. Her words didn't ask for understanding. They demanded accountability. She laid out the history, not as a list of dates and events, but as a map showing exactly how we got here. She drew a straight line from redlining and voter suppression to school closures and police overreach. She reminded the audience that these issues aren't disconnected or accidental. They're systemic, designed. And when she said it, there was no room left for excuses. You could see people start to shift in their seats, not because she was being disrespectful, but because she was being honest. And for those who had gotten comfortable in their silence, her honesty was disarming. She wasn't there to soothe or to placate. She was there to testify, to speak on behalf of those who've been ignored, misunderstood, and dismissed. For every black child told to settle for less. For every grandmother who marched and still watches the same cycle play out decades later. For every parent who fears what might happen when their kid goes out for the night and doesn't come home on time. She made it clear, this isn't a debate over ideas. This is a fight for dignity, for survival, for truth. She told the stories others don't want to hear, the ones that get buried in data and disguised in technical jargon. The stories of being followed in stores, pulled over for nothing, overlooked for jobs, judged before speaking. She took the statistics and gave them faces, gave them voices, gave them pain and resilience and humanity. And in doing that, she challenged the very foundation of the discussion. Because once you see injustice, you can't unsee it. Once someone dares to name it aloud, it changes the room. Suddenly, those who had once felt comfortable speaking in generalities are forced to confront specifics. Suddenly, neutrality feels like complicity, and that's what made her so powerful. She didn't let anyone sit safely on the fence. This wasn't just a political moment. It was a moral one. The kind that doesn't fade when the cameras turn off. The kind that echoes long after the soundstage clears out. It was a moment when truth refused to be polite. When truth came dressed not in diplomacy, but in righteousness. When truth looked straight into the eyes of those in power and said, "You don't get to pretend anymore." There was a steadiness to her delivery that made it all the more impactful. No theatrics, no raised voice, just precision, confidence, authority. The kind that comes from knowing your worth, your history, and your right to speak. She wasn't there to be agreeable. She was there to be unforgettable. And she was. Because the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was loaded. It was the sound of truth landing hard, of people realizing that what had just been said couldn't be unspoken. There was no spin that could dilute it, no distraction that could overshadow it. She had reshaped the conversation, and everyone knew it. She showed what it means to lead from a place of principle, to not just represent people, but to defend them, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's unpopular. She didn't deliver a performance. She delivered a confrontation. A challenge, a call to wake up, to own up, and to finally stop pretending that the mask slipped, and for the first time in a long time, the world saw the fear behind the bluster. That's what happens when someone who's built a wall of bravado and image is confronted with truth that cuts too deep to dodge. And the one delivering that truth wasn't shouting or pointing fingers. She was deliberate, focused, and absolutely relentless. Not in anger, but in purpose. The shift in the room was almost invisible at first, but then it was unmistakable. A tight jaw, a glance away, a hesitation in the usual rhythm of the response. That was the moment when the mask began to crack. What made it so powerful wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. There was no grandstanding, no theatrical pause for applause, just a steady stream of undeniable facts wrapped in a calm but piercing delivery. The kind of delivery that doesn't just challenge someone, it corners them. It forces them to stand in the mirror and see what they've tried to hide behind carefully crafted statements and pre-approved narratives. She didn't need to accuse. She simply revealed. And in revealing, she left no place to hide. The data spoke for itself. The timelines, the actions, the repeated decisions that had real-world consequences for real people. She connected the dots with precision, showing not just the incidents but the patterns, the long, uncomfortable thread running through them all. And the more she spoke, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just an argument. It was a revelation. The response that followed was telling, defensive, evasive, and most of all, shaken. It was the kind of reaction that happens when someone realizes they're no longer in control of the narrative. When the usual tactics, changing the subject, deflecting blame, throwing out distractions, don't work anymore. Because the truth, being spoken, wasn't coming from opinion. It was coming from lived reality, from history, from communities that have borne the weight of injustice and are no longer willing to carry it quietly. She had shifted the dynamic completely. It was no longer about controlling the conversation, it was about answering to it. And the fear wasn't loud or obvious, it was in the eyes, in the forced smile, in the delayed response. Because deep down there was a realization. This moment couldn't be dismissed like all the others. This wasn't just another critic, this was a mirror being held up, and the reflection wasn't easy to look at. The silence that followed her words spoke volumes. Not the silence of agreement, but the silence of exposure, of recognition. She hadn't come to debate policy in the abstract. She came to talk about the lives affected by those policies, the families torn apart, the futures altered, the promises broken. And she did so with the calm intensity of someone who understands that truth is its own weapon. And she wielded it masterfully. What unraveled in that moment wasn't just a person's composure. It was a whole image, an image that had been protected for years through rehearsed lines and friendly platforms. But under the weight of her facts, her clarity, and her unshakable presence, that image began to collapse. Not with a bang, but with a slow, invisible crumble. The kind that can't be fixed with a press release or a tweet. What made her delivery so devastatingly effective was the lack of venom. She didn't mock. She didn't gloat. She simply laid it all bare. And that's what made it impossible to refute. Her calm became a kind of pressure. The steadier she remained, the more the discomfort on the other side grew. The tighter the grip, the more it slipped. She spoke for those who are never in the room when decisions are made. For those who suffer quietly when leaders pretend problems don't exist. And in doing so, she broke through the protective armor of privilege and positioning. She didn't bring chaos, she brought clarity. And in a space where noise often overshadows substance, her clarity became a storm. That's when the panic set in. Because nothing is more threatening to power than someone who cannot be rattled, cannot be silenced, and cannot be dismissed. Someone who speaks not for applause, but for justice. Someone who doesn't blink when the truth makes people squirm. She became that someone. And in that moment, all the practiced confidence and public swagger in the world couldn't hold up against it. America needed a voice, and Jasmine Crockett became the megaphone. In a time when so many tiptoe around uncomfortable truths, when statements are massaged and filtered through layers of strategy and caution, she did something radical. She told the truth plainly. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't worry about who might get uncomfortable. Her voice didn't tremble, and her message wasn't buried in metaphors. She spoke directly, and in doing so, she gave voice to millions who've been waiting for someone, anyone, to say what they've known in their bones for years. She didn't just speak from intellect, she spoke from experience, from pain, from pride. From generations of stories passed down at kitchen tables and whispered in church pews, she carried the weight of those voices with her, and when she stepped into that moment, she refused to let them be silenced. That refusal came through with every word she spoke. Not loud for the sake of volume, but clear with the force of certainty. She wasn't reading a script. She was delivering a truth that demanded to be heard. And people listened. Not just the ones in the room, not just the ones with titles and microphones. Everyday people stopped scrolling. They turned the volume up. They called friends and said, "Did you hear what she just said?" Because what she was doing wasn't routine political commentary. It was something deeper. She was breaking through the numbness that so often clouds the national conversation. Through her voice, she cut through apathy like a blade. For those who have grown tired of performative concern, she was a jolt of something real. There was no both sides in her delivery, no false equivalence, no effort to make oppression sound more palatable. She didn't soften the blow. She didn't dress injustice up in diplomacy. She named it. And in naming it, she gave people language for what they've been living. That's why her voice mattered. Because it validated what others have felt for so long, and it reminded them that they aren't crazy for seeing what they see or feeling what they feel. She wasn't simply reacting to a moment, she was shaping one. She transformed a routine, exchange into a national reflection, into a gut check. She challenged the audience, not with hostility, but with purpose. "Now that you know," her words seemed to ask, "what will you do with it?" That's the kind of question that lingers. It stays with you. It's what turns a headline into a movement. In a world where so much of what we hear is polished and rehearsed, she offered something raw and authentic. She didn't flinch when the stakes got high. She leaned in. That's what leaders do. Not the ones who seek attention, but the ones who seek accountability. Her courage wasn't loud or brash. It was the kind of courage that builds slowly over time, from living through what others only read about. From watching doors close, rules shift, expectations drop, all because of the color of your skin or the zip code you live in. And when she spoke, she did something rare. She made people feel seen. Not just those who agree with her politics or her perspective, but those who have spent years feeling like they're yelling into the void. She turned the void into a platform. She didn't beg to be heard. She commanded it. Because when someone is that rooted in truth, when they speak, from a place that deep, you don't have to raise your voice to be powerful. You just have to be real. She didn't come for sympathy. She came with resolve, with a voice sharpened by injustice and strengthened by hope. Hope that this country can face its truth. Hope that people will stop whispering what needs to be shouted. Hope that clarity, when spoken with force, can shake the foundations of indifference. And for once, it wasn't an activist on the outside banging on the door. It was someone already inside, refusing to sit down, refusing to stay quiet. That's what makes moments like this unforgettable. They change more than just the tone. They change the possibilities. They open up space for honesty. They force uncomfortable conversations. And most importantly, they remind the people watching at home, the ones who've been told their stories don't matter, their pain isn't valid, their anger isn't justified, that there is someone in the room who sees them, who hears them, and who will not let the silence win. So when the cameras finally dimmed and the headlines began to churn, something had already shifted, permanently. What Jasmine Crockett delivered wasn't just a viral moment. It was a message that cut through spin and spectacle and reached straight into the soul of a country that too often pretends not to know its own reflection. She didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. Truth carries its own thunder, and she brought a storm that no one saw coming. In that space, where spin usually outpaces sincerity, she offered neither apology nor permission. Just facts, just clarity, just power. Her words didn't aim to win applause. They aimed to wake people up. She didn't try to cross the aisle with vague language or avoid offense for the sake of optics. She said what needed to be said, and because of that, she became what so few dare to be anymore. Undeniable. The strength of that moment didn't just lie in her command of the facts. It lived in her embodiment of the communities too often left behind in policy decisions. Every syllable she spoke carried generations. Every pause was filled with names we'll never hear, but who lived this reality every day. She wasn't speaking about those people. She was those people. And when someone like that has the mic, it becomes sacred. It becomes necessary. And people noticed. Not just the ones on the defensive shifting nervously in their seats, but the people in living rooms across the country. The grandmother in Detroit who nodded quietly at her screen. The college student in Atlanta who texted the clip to everyone in her contact list. The young boy in Baton Rouge who, for the first time, saw someone who sounded like his mom speak truth without fear on national television. It was more than politics. It was connection. It was representation with backbone. What Jasmine Crockett did was pull back the curtain not just on a person, but on a system, a pattern, a history that too many try to sanitize. She refused to let the nation forget, refused to let the moment pass quietly, and in doing so, she became something bigger than the room she was in. She became a reminder that truth, when spoken without compromise, still has the power to shake the floorboards of the most powerful institutions. She reminded everyone watching that justice doesn't require permission, and that silence, especially in the face of injustice, is complicity. Her voice didn't echo because of the volume. It echoed because it came from a place that was real, earned, and unshakable. And that kind of voice doesn't just pass through the news cycle. It lingers, it challenges, it inspires. This wasn't just about exposing someone. It was about exposing everything that allows injustice to endure. And in doing so, Jasmine Crockett didn't just stand up. She stood out. She gave the nation something rare, a moment of truth in a time of noise, a moment people won't forget.